All right, what's up, guys? It's Tyler. I am not too sure how this is gonna work. This is like my first time doing one of these, but basically, I've got a topic lecture for you guys about populism worldwide. We're gonna talk about what populism is, and then we're gonna look at some different effects of populism and like what those effects have been throughout the world. So to start, we just got a picture of like an America First populist rally in the United States. So first, we're going to start with what is populism. I just said so first. All right, whatever. So what is populism? So on the right, we got like these two Polish guys, two Polish right-wing populists. There is both left-wing and right-wing populism, since in the common vernacular, populism is typically referring to right-wing populism. That is what this topic lecture is mostly going to be focused on. So populism, like sort of put simply, it's politics that are meant to appeal to the common citizen and to draw a dichotomy between the commoners and the elites, with this idea that there's this sort of nefarious elite trying to trample the common people of a given nation, and that the common people need to back policies that put themselves first in order to counteract these elites and basically reclaim their country or make themselves stronger, reassert themselves in their own nation. What's interesting about it is it's not really, it doesn't really fit perfectly into the right or left dichotomy. Most populist movements are socially right. They're nationalist, they're traditionalist, they're religious, they're conservative. They typically espouse religion and national heritage as core parts of their movements, but at the same time, due to their sort of love of the common man or purported love of the common man, they do sort of engage in these welfare state policies. In many populist movements around the world, it's not uncommon to see people who might believe in a state religion advocating for an integrated national healthcare system in the same breath. So it's not really a dichotomy in this case, and populism does combine both socially right and economic left elements, which is part of what makes it so appealing for many people around the world. It's also nationalist and traditionalist, like I already mentioned. Nationalism is huge among populist movements, pride in one's nation and one's culture, and that sort of goes hand in hand with traditionalism, the desire to maintain tradition and the desire to take pride in one's traditions. This is sort of the glue that holds these populist movements together and gives the supporters of populist movements something to actually unify around. And then finally, part of why it's so dire and why I'm even giving this topic lecture to you to begin with is because populism is spreading in popularity across the world, especially in the West. So that's Western Europe and the Anglo colonies around the world, and also, in certain parts, Eastern/Orthodox Europe and Latin America. So it's particularly sorry, I'm not feeling great. I'm a little sick, but it's particularly dire in these areas, and these are sort of the places we're going to be zeroing in on the most. So to start, we're going to talk about populism in the Americas. We have a picture of Donald Trump on the right in one of his rallies. Trump is obviously one of the biggest populists in the world, probably the most famous and most well-known populist across the world. So the Trump presidency in 2016 was a major part of the populism wave. There's this sort of Amerocentric idea that Trump kickstarted the global populism wave. That's not really the case. Trump wasn't the catalyst for populism so much as he was the American expression of that desire for populism we see all across the West and all across the world. Populism, at least in the United States, was primarily driven by things like increased immigration to the southern border, a lack of economic opportunity or a perceived lack of economic opportunity, and increased animosity between people in what's known as Middle America, the Midwest, the South, up against those from the coasts. They saw juxtaposition there. They viewed themselves as sort of the common people, and the people on the coast as these elites who were trying to force their own way of life upon them. Now, regardless of whether or not that's true, it definitely struck a chord. At this point in time, about 50% of Americans support populism. About 50% of Americans did vote for Donald Trump in the election. So this populism wave is definitely something that's occurring, and it's something that has had pretty interesting ramifications in the American political system. But of course, at the same time, it's also very important that we talk about populism in other portions of the world, or rather in other portions of the Americas. So in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, somebody who's commonly known as the Trump of the tropics, if you've heard that classic extemp joke, has also been expressing very similar populist sentiments. In Brazil, he's been in favor of increased deforestation of the Amazon and increased production in factories to sort of embolden the Brazilian people economically. He's been opposed to COVID-19 restrictions. He views these as restrictions that are basically being used to beat down the Brazilian people. And he's even stated that he's not planning on conceding the next election if he loses, and he's willing to use military force to maintain his power. He's also, of course, very conservative, very Catholic, and basically Bolsonaro is sort of the Brazilian version of populism. And there's significant enemies towards him throughout Brazil, but generally he has garnered mainstream support, but he is an incredibly polarizing figure. Nicaragua and Venezuela are both left-wing nations. They're both governed by communist parties, but they're also typically grouped under populism because they were able to gain their power through essentially saying, you know, we are the common people. There are these elites who own most of the good things in this country. We are going to take those things and use them to build a better nation for everyone. So Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela is a populist. He's socially conservative as well. And of course, he is for state control of oil and of the oil industry, which has not resulted in particularly good ramifications for Venezuela. Nicaragua, of course, we're seeing increased stratification. We're seeing lots of animosity towards the ruling regime. So populism has provoked a stern response in Nicaragua and Venezuela, but of course it is important to mention that this is populism of a more left-wing bent and not so much of a right-wing bent. I'm still including it sort of in its own separate category because it's very important and will definitely feature in some speeches. And then finally in Argentina, sort of Brazil's brother to the south, we're seeing a very similar form of populism. I believe right now Argentina's government is controlled by these sort of left-wing forces who have been able to get things passed like legislation allowing abortion, which is pretty unique for Argentina. It only occurred a few years ago. But of course, we've been seeing stern backlash to this. Argentina does have a legacy of right-wing autocracy, with Juan Perón being the autocrat of the nation for a very long time. He was a Catholic autocrat, and there's still a lot of nostalgia for Perón in many parts of Argentina. There was widespread protest against the new abortion laws, and we're definitely seeing population beginning to grow there as well. I'm sorry I'm going a little bit fast. I do need to keep it short. There's a lot to dive into here. This is just a very cursory survey, so please go in and look into this a little bit more on your own. Next up, we got Western Europe on the right. This is a populist gathering in France for Marine Le Pen, the leader of the largest right-wing party in France, and the party that is actually projected to win the next election, or to do at least incredibly well in the next election. So populist movements are very heavily entrenched in Western Europe. That definitely isn't sort of the perception we have here. We tend to view Western Europe as being progressive, being left-wing, but there's also a very strong sort of counter-revolutionary force across Western Europe, a force that doesn't like this EU sort of mania throughout Europe, that doesn't like globalism, that doesn't like this free movement of peoples that we're seeing, and these populists are gaining lots of power. I did put Brexit on there 3 times. Brexit, because Brexit is probably one of the most important examples of populism in Europe. We have the Tory party, the sort of establishment right-wing party with some populist elements, taking Britain out of the EU and bringing them back to be their own independent, unaffiliated nation. So this is definitely one of the sort of most egregious examples of populism. Brexit is textbook populism. There are these elites in the EU that are dictating what Brits can and cannot do. Therefore, we will remove the country from the EU and be in charge of our own destiny. Matteo Salvini with the 5-Star Movement, another great example of populism. Italian populism is possibly the most active in Western Europe. Matteo Salvini campaigned on a platform of getting rid of refugees, significantly restricting immigration, because Italy's been having a huge problem with illegal immigration. He ran on a platform of sort of these more left-wing economic incentives to bring the wealth back to the people, and he got elected for that, and he served as the Italian PM for a very long time. He's also very religious and sought to increase Catholic influence throughout Italy. In Germany, AfD, or Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, is on the rise. They aren't as big of a threat as populist parties in other regions of Europe. AfD campaigned on a very similar platform, opposition to Angela Merkel, and especially opposition to increased immigration, which they see as a serious threat to Germany. Vox is, of course, another party that's doing this in Spain. Generally the same story across the board, really. There's definitely lots to get into for each of these parties, but just as a general survey, just remember these are populist parties in Western Europe. They arose because primarily of the Syrian refugee crisis and the immigration that followed, and they are all picking up steam and performing very well in the polls. Eastern Europe, on the other hand, is possibly the heartland of populism. They have populist leaders, populist governments, and populists have major widespread support among most people. Just for reference, in the top we have a populist gathering in Hungary, and on the bottom one in Ukraine. You can see very similar imagery, flags, candles, armbands on the top, just the symbols of national strength and national unity. Hungary and Poland both have very strong right-wing governments. Both of them are religious, traditional, nationalistic, but interestingly, they are in favor of membership within the EU, although the EU does not love them back, primarily because they view the EU as being their biggest defense against Russia. The Hungarian leader Viktor Orban also recently opted for a power grab in which he's given himself near autocratic power, although he also did give permission to the Hungarian parliament to take that power away from him. So, of course, we all know how the story goes, but we'll see how that pans out. You know, maybe he'll be the first to actually hand the power back. In Ukraine, the Donbass War, a war between the Ukraine and Russia, has allowed populists to take hold in Ukraine, and we've seen this sort of right-wing renaissance in Ukraine, especially with the Azov Battalion, a political and military union of right-wing militants that they were first a volunteered battalion in the Ukraine in the Donbass War to fight against Russia, and now they're primarily a political movement, and they've been integrated into the National Guard. There's been strong opposition internally and externally to the populism in these countries. There have been massive protests in Poland regarding restrictive abortion legislation, massive protests in the Ukraine regarding their stance towards Russia, protests in Poland because of their refusal to allow refugees, as Dominik Tuczynski, one of Poland's government ministers, famously stated, Poland has let in absolutely no refugees and they hope to keep it that way. So basically, there's been a lot of animosity, and these are very controversial positions, but broadly, they do have mainstream support, and that's why these parties have been able to stay in power for so long. Finally, we get to Asia. Asia is not as beholden to populism as some other nations. In the top right, we have a picture of Rodrigo Duterte, the populist leader of the Philippines. So sort of in line with that, populism is the most prominent in Southeast Asia, with the notable exceptions of Narendra Modi in India and Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan, both of whom, as you hopefully know, are running on very distinctly populist platforms. Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines is a well-known populist leader. He is Muslim, which is unique because the Philippines is a very strongly Catholic nation. But part of the reason he got elected is because he had some very interesting solutions to ending the Philippines' drug crisis. As you can see through his gun right there, he is strongly in favor of firearm ownership. He's urged Filipinos to buy guns and shoot and kill drug dealers. And while he has been successful in reducing drug proliferation and usage in the Philippines, there has been strong criticism of his methods for being too heavy-handed. It's also a major time of transition in Southeast Asia. We're seeing a lot of the old order, such as in Thailand with their monarchy, Cambodia with their monarchy, facing strong opposition from people who view those things as archaic, too traditional, and outdated. So in this case, we have a lot of people turning to populists to preserve what they view as sort of their national culture and heritage. Once again, Thailand is dealing with their anti-monarchy protests. Those have been going on for a long time, and a recent coup in Myanmar, which ousted the democratically elected government and replaced it with military rule, has resulted in something very similar. Basically just increased animosity, skepticism abroad, and just serious issues when it comes to that. So yeah, that about concludes our topic lecture. It's about 13 minutes long, so hopefully it wasn't too long of a watch for you. Again, I do apologize, I am a little bit sick, but hopefully you learned something from it. You can apply some of that to your speeches. Populism is a massive topic, and it's just very important to know about when it comes to extent to integrate into your speeches, just populism around the world and the way it's grown. If you skipped to the end, which you should not be doing, you should come back and do the whole thing all over again. Just remember a few things. First of all, populism is growing throughout the world. Second of all, populism is a combination of right-wing social policy and left-wing economic policy. And finally, while there has been strong resistance to populism, many people around the world view it as many people view it as the solution to what they perceive as national and cultural degradation. They believe they are preserving their culture and preserving their nation. So anyway, thanks for watching.